Audio is now recording 2. Okay. Well, so first of all, I was going to do a quick introduction for John, which John doesn't know I'm about to do. But so John and I actually met at Game Creation Society at Carnegie Mellon, which was a club a lot like this one, except it was 9 years prior. Which, besides being 9 years ago, actually means a lot of things. It means like Unity was years away, indie development was kind of not really a big topic yet, IGF was sort of in its infancy. It was a completely different scene, but by the time I met John, through that Game Creation Society, he had already completed a few Game Boy Advance games. Which, like, so some of y'all in the room, actually, if you've taken classes like CS 2261 or 2210, I think, you've also made Game Boy Advance games, so that's kind of around the area where John got some of his start. He actually sort of was different than the other members in there. A lot of us, including myself at the time, would be on like 1 or 2 teams at a time, doing 1 or 2 roles, while John would be doing 2D and 3D art, programming, doing design work, animating stuff, making audio, designing for projects, leading a project or 2. And I don't mean spread out over time, I mean simultaneously across the 4 to 5 to 6 games we're working on at once, which if you've been around VJDev, you know there's a few of us who do that too. We're sort of following in the model John set of like just being sort of quietly productive as a maniac, doing cool stuff. And so while he built up that pile of work, we got a lot of chance to work together on a number of student projects throughout the time. And after I graduated, I went off to EA. Then general manager Neil Young, not that Neil Young, different Neil Young, made a statement that one of the more important things in his career has been finding someone that he likes to work with and then making sure like he does whatever he has to do to make sure he can work with that person. I'm like, that sounds sensible. So I tried to get them to hire John. For various reasons, they didn't bite. But ZipZapPlay, a new startup started by co-founder of Game Creation Society, Kurt Barrington, did hire John. So I was like, Audio CA, I'm going to work at that startup, ZipZapPlay. For the next few years, John and I lived in the same place, worked at ZipZapPlay. We also started doing some iPhone games together. So the iPhone games, some of y'all know that I worked on, Topple, Alice in Bomberland, iZombie Death March. John helped with art or with programming or with other aspects of those from the concept up. So some of the work that you might think of as being my work, because you happen to know me, was oftentimes John and I collaborating on those projects. So you may know more of his projects and his background before that game company than you may know. And after those times, so like in addition to those projects though, he's always about doing game jams, sharing his work with others, hacking and tinkering late at night. And so this is of course part of his sharing his work. It's just at a different scale than maybe the time when he and I were collaborating on little iPhone games and such. But without further ado, we'll give John the floor.
I think you got the wrong screen.
Oh, or do we?
About a year ago, I was deep in the trenches of that game company, concentrating on the development of Journey and dealing with the challenges of building such an unusual game. At the time, it was hard for me to tell what to expect when the game would be released. There wasn't really anything like it on the market. In fact, that's kind of the point. We wanted to make something just different from everything else. But that didn't leave us with much certainty about how it would be received. I knew how much praise that game company received for the previous game, Flower, but I was still relatively new to the team, so I couldn't be sure how Journey compared. Especially since, by this point, we were in our 3rd year of development on Journey, on what was supposed to be just a 2-year development schedule. And ultimately, what we were making was just like a 2 or 3 hour experience. So this seemed like it was a lot of work for such a little game. My name is John Nesky, as you see. I joined that game company 2 years ago as a field engineer, which is a role that merges programming with design. Every component of a game interacts the user experience, graphics, even especially the interactions. So TGC invented the title field engineer to describe developers who understand how their facets of the game contribute to the experience and fit together with each other. On Journey, I worked on the motion and control of the player character and the camera, integrating these systems with the environments and everything else to fulfill our vision. Luckily for us, Journey has turned out to be a smashing success. It is the fastest selling game on the PlayStation Network, and by some metrics, it's the best game of 2012. I think this game rankings metric is probably outdated, but it's received various awards for Indie Game of the Year, sometimes Game of the Year, sometimes Best Downloadable. It was kind of weird going to a GEC and being up on stage finally. It's kind of a dream come true, and we have to come up with new goals now. We receive hundreds of passionate fan mails and dedicated cosplayers and our own online community. There's even custom Journey tattoos. The game is popular with a wider demographic than most PlayStation games and stirs emotions in players that many thought video games never could. I'm especially fascinated, though, by the stories that players need to tell about their experiences playing the game. Our fans needed an outlet so badly that they created a whole website just dedicated to sharing their stories at journeystories.tumblr.com. If you click on the archive link, you'll find thousands of these stories and other fan works posted online. Surely this word-of-mouth marketing has contributed to our success. But the important thing to me is that players felt like they had such meaningful experiences that they just had to share. Looking back on the development of Journey, I want to share with you some of the design decisions and problem solving that went into making all this possible. The Journey team was a small, tight-knit family, about a dozen people, and we felt it was important to be clear about our goals with each other and have a shared vision for everyone to pursue. As a result, whenever we had disagreements over design decisions, the conflict was rarely over what our goals should be, but rather over how we could accomplish those goals most effectively with the resources we had. And for Journey, the overarching shared vision that we cared about was to make players feel catharsis. In 1982, Electronic Arts, their marketing department, issued the challenge, "Can a computer game make you cry?" And ever since then, game critics have been repeating the same question about video games. Probably most famously, Peter Molyneux has been chasing this question. But it turns out it's actually pretty difficult, unless the question is phrased exactly like this: can a computer make you cry, or can a game make you cry? The answer is obviously yes. It happens to people all the time. I can tell you from personal experience that losing progress in a game has made me cry. But I don't think that's what anyone had in mind when they asked the question. What we're really asking about is the concept of catharsis. Game critics call into question whether video games can be legitimately art, challenging us all to prove it. I don't think, personally, I don't believe that this is the only valid way to be art, by any means. But it is an interesting challenge, and that game company accepted it. From the beginning, Journey was an attempt to create a feeling of catharsis. However, it's a literary term, and it's not even clear how it applies to video games. The development of Journey was a constant search to find out how it might. Catharsis refers to a buildup of emotional tension, followed by profound relief and reflection. We can think of it as a curve representing changing emotions over time. You probably recognize this arc from school. I don't know if you called it that, but Freytag's pyramid. It's a common grade school diagram of dramatic tension with a rising action and then a climax followed by a resolution, or denouement, or whatever you want to call it. So our creative director, Genova Chen, created a very similar diagram that we used to guide our design internally. As I'm sure many of you already know, we're influenced by the monomyth and the hero's journey, as Joseph Campbell talked about it. It was definitely an inspiration for Genova and for the rest of the team. The monomyth was created by analyzing countless stories and compiling a list of shared elements. And it essentially kind of expands on common techniques for creating the right emotional arc, often subdividing the arc into a 3-act structure that is now well known in film theory. So that game company decided to adapt this diagram to guide our design with progressively stronger emotional pyramids in each act. Although actually, the diagram that we used is upside down. Normally, like this rising line represents an increase in tension, whereas our diagram actually represents sort of the release of tension, with a rising action at the very end for the total release of what had been weighing you down, literally giving you the power of flight in this case. At the end of the game, the most powerful release is when you can fly and defy gravity. A recurring theme in Journey is the struggle against gravity, actually. It's fitting that the English language uses words like gravity as a metaphor for negative emotions and levity for positive emotions. Over the course of the game, the player's ability to physically transcend gravity and achieve weightlessness closely follows this curve. But we have to remember that what we're ultimately pursuing isn't a physical journey, but an emotional one. And creating emotions is not as simple as telling you what to feel. The diagram was our goal, but it's not a map for how to get there. Using flight as a symbol for emotion is a neat trick, but we had to come up with more ideas. So we kind of wanted to appeal to children and adults, and we feel like a lot of games that are designed, or AAA games now, are kind of designed for a child mindset. But we have to keep in mind that adults have different emotional responses to things. Adults have seen more of the world, and they're probably more jaded and harder to surprise and delight. They expect their entertainment to hold more relevance to their lives. So the success of the social games movement over the past few years has proven that there's a need for more personal games. Developing a social context in which a player's experiences and emotions are shared with other people bring meaning to the player's own experiences. So one of our core ideas in coming up with a design for Journey was to make a multiplayer game. In a way, this made our job a lot harder because other players can be unpredictable, and online multiplayer games are notorious for bringing out the worst in people. It was a big risk and probably would have scared off a larger team with a more mainstream fan base. So I have to thank Sony for having faith in our little experiment. Ultimately, making a multiplayer game was the right decision. I'll go back. Shared experiences are simply more powerful, and social connections can provide the relevance and meaning that is hard for us designers to achieve when we don't actually know anything about our players ahead of time. Social psychologists have developed what they call self-determination theory, which suggests that there are three basic psychological needs that all humans have. The first two, autonomy and competence, are well served by the mainstream game industry, which is full of games about wish fulfillment and mastery. But the third basic psychological need, called relatedness, is harder to come by. People have a need to relate to and connect with each other. But even the so-called social games actually have trouble accomplishing this sometimes. Though all the rage, most social games aren't truly social in terms of forging emotional experiences between people. Usually, players are just exchanging in-game goods or gunfire. If we could just figure out how to get players to share a personal connection while they're experiencing Journey, we'd be able to evoke all the emotional highs and lows that we seek for our diagram. But of course, that's easier said than done. Conventional wisdom in the game industry is that when people feel safely anonymous on the internet, they tend to act more like assholes. This would be great if anger was the emotion we were going for, but anger has no place on our desired emotional arc. So we had to have faith in ourselves that we could create an environment where people would behave differently. The most obvious way to create a friendly environment would be to incentivize good behavior and punish trolls. And many online games do employ moderators to punish trolls, but that game company doesn't have the resources for moderators. So how could we stop players from yelling at each other? When we created our first prototype, a 4-player cooperative game, the first thing we did was simply to just prohibit talking altogether. We figured that would prevent most of the trolling that went on. The player character has no mouth, explaining why they can't talk to each other. But the important thing is not the explanation, but the rule: no talking means no yelling at each other. So instead of talking, players have a single action button allowing them to get each other's attention with a signal. And we found that you can actually communicate a lot using just body language and signals. Certainly sometimes it can be hard to understand what someone is trying to get across, but in a way that can be a good thing. If players are actively working to try to understand each other, it does strengthen their emotional connection. And in a way it feels more like pure emotion. I often feel like when people are expressing emotion to each other, they're doing it through words, which often conveys more meaning than what they're really trying to get across, which is just I'm upset or I'm happy or something. So the shouting in this game kind of is more a direct representation of emotion than sentence and grammar and all that. So we actually did successfully prevent destructive language. That was simple. However, when we were testing our prototype, players were still engaging in other destructive behaviors. They were pushing each other off of cliffs. And for a while, we couldn't understand why, because there's no in-game reward for pushing anyone off a cliff. In fact, the game was easier to play when everyone's together, so there really shouldn't have been any incentive to be mean to each other. And we actually started to feel depressed about human nature for a while. But then Genova had an epiphany while talking to a child psychologist. She explained that when children are born, they're born without any moral values. They don't know right from wrong. All they know is what they see, and they do whatever seems to provide the most interesting feedback. Similarly, when someone is playing a new and strange game for the first time, they don't have any context for what is considered acceptable behavior. They haven't learned the etiquette, and they're effectively children in this context, doing whatever seems to provide the most feedback. And in our prototype, where the only choice is to run, signal, and push, pushing created just more feedback than not pushing. In fact, it was the single strongest influence players had on the virtual world that we had created. So ultimately, the way to stop them from pushing each other was to just take away the ability to push entirely. Same thing as what we did for your yelling. The player character in Journey has no arms and cannot force another player to go anywhere. After we took away the ability to push, helping each other became the best way to get feedback. So players naturally started doing that instead. Preventing blatantly destructive behaviors is one thing, but we still need to find a way to encourage cooperation. Even without speaking or forcing each other off of cliffs, players in our prototype were still having undesirable conflicts. We soon realized that one of the reasons for the conflict was simply that in our prototype there were 4 players. 4 allows plenty of room for jealousy and competition, not to mention the chance for confusion and distraction. Whenever the players start to veer off in different directions, there's anxiety over which group to follow. And 3 has even more danger for leaving the odd one out. So we decided to cut it down to just 2 players, creating a more personal and thus more powerful connection, while minimizing the opportunities for anyone to feel hurt. So we developed an online multiplayer system that automatically and subtly matches 2 players who are alone, giving them the ability to see each other and no one else. If they become separated, they're alone again, and they're eligible to be matched with someone else who's in the same area, but they might never see who they left behind again, just like someone they pass on the street. It works so well that many players never even realize that anything special is happening, and some players take a while to realize that they're playing with another human instead of a robot. Or at least, that was what was happening at the beginning of the journey. By now, I think a lot of people kind of understand what's going on. But there's still there are definitely many people who have not heard of it. And when they figure out that they're playing with other humans, they want to stay close to anyone who seems friendly for fear of losing them. We deliberately created a desolate landscape, covered in sand dunes and gravestones and ruined temples, just to emphasize this feeling of loneliness. Loneliness heightens the desire to connect with someone, anyone, and to treasure that connection when you establish it. Players in Journey are delighted to meet each other, and they go out of their way to help each other. Some players, skeptical of online multiplayer, play Journey alone for the first time, and they usually regret it upon realizing how friendly everyone can be in Journey. Now, if everyone likes to play together, you might think that we would force everyone to play together. And indeed, that was how our original prototype worked. Like in most cooperative games, we designed puzzles and challenges that players had to work together to overcome. If players were in trouble, other players could save and heal them, and periodically players would have to stand together to open the gate to progress forwards. But essentially, we were giving players tasks to perform, which incidentally could not be completed alone. It turns out, this is like when you're ordering fast food and you have to interact with the cashier. When people are in the mindset for performing such mechanical tasks, they stop trying to make connections with people, even if they need to be having a conversation with them. Other people become tools or resources, losing their humanity. So Genova likes to cite St. Augustine, and paraphrasing, he says, "People will venture out to the height of the mountain to seek wonder. They will stand and stare at the width of the ocean to be filled with wonder. But when they pass one another in the street and feel nothing, yet every individual is a miracle. How strange that nobody sees the wonder in one another." In some ways, Journey is a direct response to this observation. Players naturally venture out to the mountain that we place in front of them, seeking wonder without any need for instructions. But in Journey, we want players to see the wonder in each other. So we stripped out from Journey all but the simplest of tasks and puzzles from the game, to the point where, honestly, it's hardly even recognizable as a game. We keep the mountain as an obvious destination, but we allow the players to journey towards it at their own pace, free from any rules about what they need to accomplish in order to get there. There are various hidden puzzles, or prizes, rather, strewn around Journey, but none of them are required. Players will never need to backtrack if they missed something, and they can never die either. In a way, the resulting experience is more true to life. In our day-to-day experiences, we don't really have to worry about whether or not we're going to die if we make a wrong move, or whether we won't be allowed past the door unless we've collected enough trinkets. With mechanical problem solving gone, players are more likely to actually pay attention to each other. But when we took away mechanical reasons for players to stay together, we could still have kept the technical rule that kept them in proximity to each other. After all, playing together is what people love most about the game, right? So why allow them to play alone? The game could require an internet connection to run, like SimCity, and it could make sure that players would stay close together by teleporting them whenever they got separated. However, we felt that the connections that people formed would be meaningless unless they were voluntary. So whenever two players are together, one of them could choose to leave, and often they do. But when they stay together, they both know that that must be what they want to do, and they feel special knowing that the other player could have been with anyone else, but chooses to stay together for no reason other than friendliness. So we chose to design all of the obstacles in the game so that you can overcome them alone should you ever want to venture onwards without your current partner. And we designed the online partnering system to disconnect players who seem like they're drifting apart, so that perhaps they'll reconnect with someone else. But there was one more source of conflict that we found, and this was a little more subtle. It has to do with this power of flight. The power has to be limited, or else players would just take a shortcut through the sky, skipping the entire journey and losing the experience. In particular, flight has to be more limited during moments when we are trying to create tension, and less limited during times when we're trying to release tension. So we needed a way to control how much players could fly. We made a resource system where the player could carry a certain amount of flight power, and we could vary how much of this power was available. These little flying cloths here, we call them strands internally. They are the resource, and originally in the game, when you shouted at them, they would come into you and then it kind of become part of you. And then when you fly, they would fall away from you. A mechanical gameplay element then had snuck its way back into our design, and our first iteration of this system left something to be desired. When players were collecting and spending these strands, they felt anxiety about spending them wastefully. They would hoard the cloth without using it more than they had to. And when they did use it, they would quickly return to the source where they could replenish it, going back and forth every time they used more. So the system in this case was unintentionally rewarding greed in a way. Even worse, there wasn't an option for players to share this resource with each other. Our solution was to change the rules. Instead of thinking of the resource as these little pieces of cloth, we adopted the visual language of glowing to indicate that your flight power is charging up. And now all of the cloth in the game does this, not just little strands. Both players are made out of cloth, so the players are incentivized to stick together because they can make each other glow on contact. Now, instead of exhibiting greed, players are sharing. Although, once again, we took care to make sure that there's never a point where players needed each other's help. Additionally, we made sure that nobody had more glow to share than anyone else. If players could only share a limited amount, then the ones who figured out how to share the most would be coveted partners, and the other players would be left behind. Instead, all players have an equal capacity to give each other flight power. It's fair for everyone. I've already mentioned a couple of the quirks of the player character. It doesn't have a mouth because we don't want it to speak, and it doesn't have arms because we don't want it to push. And its body doesn't have much weight because we want it to be able to fly convincingly. In other words, it's very different from a human, but we still want players to be able to identify with this character. And making it different from humans can actually help. If the protagonist of Journey were a white human male, then probably the majority of our players would feel like they weren't being represented. Instead, the character is alien, has ambiguous gender, allowing everyone to forget about their personal histories, and accept for a moment their new life as a piece of animated cloth. Meanwhile, the character has just enough of an anthropomorphic silhouette and face to convey that it's an intelligent creature with thoughts and feelings. We also went to great lengths to make the character more relatable through its actions. Missing arms aside, the character's body language is very human and humble. If the player stands still for a moment, the character will shuffle its feet and then eventually sit down to take a break. And if there's something interesting nearby, such as a creature or another player, the character will turn its head to look at it. And if the player directs the character to run into a wall, the character will actually bounce against the wall as if to say oof, and then it'll turn to walk along the side of the wall instead of continuing to walk directly into it. And sometimes, if the player is being indecisive about where to go, the character will even trip over itself and fall flat on its face, getting covered in sand, which it has to shake off when it stands up. All of this purely graphical animation contributes to a character that is more playful and empathetic and expressive. But we did one more thing to help players play along with the role of a cloth character. After playing through the game multiple times, players are given a new gift, a new outfit made out of white cloth. Players wearing white have extra flight power, making the game a little bit easier for them. But by the time they unlock the white cloth, they don't need the help. Instead, white cloth mostly serves to differentiate the first-time players from the experienced ones. The players who embark on multiple journeys to unlock the white cloth, they must have loved their journeys in order to play again. And when they return, they are eager to act as guides for other players to make sure their experiences go as smoothly as possible. With little more than a change in uniform, players with white cloth feel empowered to become unofficial guardians. So whenever you come across a white cloth, you can be pretty sure that it will want to teach you all the tricks. In particular, a trick that is now known as tandem flying, where two players can fly continuously while recharging each other. After all that work, we had succeeded in persuading players to enjoy others' company online. But playing together is one thing. Having an emotional journey together is something else entirely. We wanted players to feel like they had a meaningful, cathartic experience. And we wanted to do it without any conventional game mechanics for the reasons I've already given. We had to do more than just put two players in a room together, so we had to give them a world to explore. What we did is we went back to our diagram and modeled the world based on these emotional peaks and valleys. As the player progresses through the desert, coming across flying cloth creatures and other players, the intrigue starts to rise, followed by an exciting high as they dash through the quicksand canyon. Afterwards, they fall into a dark pit with beautiful cloth creatures and also terrifying beasts, forming an emotional valley. Beyond the cave is a mesmerizing golden tower, and beyond that is a snowy mountain where creatures go to die. At the end, the player collapses into an exhaustion, but in their moment of catharsis, they're revived and find themselves thrust into the heavens, where they dance into the light at the highest point in the game, the mountain peak that they've been pursuing all along. What does it all mean? Your guess is as good as mine. In fact, we were anxious this wasn't enough. So we started introducing more narrative elements, explaining the story as you go along. We created these tall white characters that we referred to as ancestors, and periodically they would stop you to lecture about the history of this world, telling anecdotes in the form of sequential art. Roughly 3 different pictures were shown each time before players were allowed to continue on their journey. The result was that a tiny fraction of our players understood exactly the story we are trying to tell, and everyone else was totally baffled about what these wordless pictures had to do with their experiences in the game. So we tried a different approach. Some of the sequences of pictures were strewn about the world on murals now, and it was up to the player to find them. And when they did, they could press the signal or shout button to advance through the frames of the sequence. But this was actually too much feedback. This time, when the players started cycling through the images in the sequence, they thought it must have been some kind of puzzle that they had to solve in order to continue, and they would get stuck on this sequence of pictures. So finally, we settled on a more abstract approach. Instead of sequences of images, we just have still images depicting a single scene on each of the murals that you find in the levels. And when the players found these, they felt relieved of the burden of trying to understand our story, and instead they were intrigued by the mystery subtly hinted at by these archaeological discoveries found in various places in the desert. So the backstory and the gameplay narratives no longer compete, they cooperate. Meanwhile, the ancestors still show you bits of history of the world, but in a way that is simpler and clearer than before. Near the end of the game, the big reveal is that this history leads directly into the story of the player's experiences playing the game. Using the same style of artwork as the history lessons, you see a reenactment of all the places that you've been as a player and the things you've done in the game so far. Crucially, in the places where you were alone, you see only one player character represented on the reenactment. But in the places where you had a partner, both characters appear, indicating that this is really about your story, not just a generic story written for all players. It's a simple trick, but it lends a little bit of significance to your journey, declaring that it's been about you all along. When players ask what they would change about the game, I've noticed that some players pick this moment and say that they wish that the gameplay reenactment was even more detailed and accurate. So this is certainly one moment where players find meaning. If we had known before release, we probably could have made it even more significant. Fortunately, players have taken this cue to heart and record their own stories to share online. So take a moment to visit journeystories.tumblr.com, where the fans have gathered. Reading through their stories, I noticed an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just towards Vec and company for making the game, but towards other players that they encounter in their travels for making the experience worthwhile. In the end, the story of Journey was not ours to write. It's yours. Thank you. Any questions?
I have a bunch of questions, but I'm afraid most of them you probably are not allowed to answer. So I started with one you probably also can't answer. But what are you guys working on now?
We don't know. I mean, we're working on a game, and it's progressing, but I can't predict what it's going to look like when it's done. Iteration isn't.
Let's just leave it.
Iteration is an important part of design. Okay, we can come back to you later. What's up? Yes, you?
Okay, I came in a bit late, so maybe you answered this already, but exactly how long did it take for you to finish this, to make the game?
3 years on a team of roughly a dozen people.
If you can say back roughly what the question
Right.
was.
Sorry. The question was, how long did it take to make Journey? 3 years. And it's supposed to be only 2 years, so we went over schedule.
How do you feel about other games that are kind of similar to Journey, like Theorester or other indie games that come out that sort of imitated it?
Well, one of the best examples is a game called Way, actually. W-A-Y. It's terrible to Google. It was made by Chris Bell and a bunch of other people, students working together to make a game. And we hired him. So Chris Bell worked on a game called Way, where there are two players, kind of opposite ends of the world. Like one was an Eskimo, and the other one was some guy in a desert. And they could see each other, and they could also see a little bit more about the other person's world. Like there were invisible platforms that maybe I couldn't see, but the person I'm playing with could see. And these two characters, instead of shouting, they had arm gestures. They could not talk to each other. They just had to like kind of gesture to each other to explain, hey, go that way, go this way. There's an invisible platform over there. Jump on this platform. So that was similar to Journey in the sense that it was about players communicating without words. And after he made that game, we hired him. As for Dear Esther, I feel like it's actually a pretty different game. In fact,
Or just sort of like pseudo games in general.
pseudo games.
Art games.
Art games.
Umbrella here.
I've also heard the term not games. I don't particularly care about the definition of the word game. I care about the spectrum of human experiences. I'm a big fan of lots of traditional game mechanics, but I'm also a fan of other things too.
Was there ever a low point in development where you really weren't sure if it was going to come together well? And when was it that you kind of realized that it was going to be this success that it was?
Oh, right, I haven't been repeating questions, sorry. Was there ever a low point when we felt like it wasn't going to come together? The answer is yes, absolutely. I personally, I was there for the last year of the 3 years. And by that point, we already kind of knew what we were trying to do. There was just a lot of problems the players were having during playtests. Playtesting was very important to see where players were tripping up. And over the course of that year, we gradually ironed out all the places where players were having trouble. There was still a little bit of anxiety that I had about whether or not we were going to have enough players that you'd be able to meet someone when you play the game. But fortunately, we have passed the threshold of having enough players that when you play the game, you can reliably find someone else. And I consider us lucky, and the game has taken off.
You mentioned playtesting a lot, and the game obviously has a broader audience than a lot of mainstream games. Did you intentionally playtest it with non-gamers, or how did you find your playtesting people?
We tried to. We had to help with help from Sony. Inside the Sony Santa Monica office, we would bring in playtesters that were getting paid to just play our game. And we would occasionally get people who would say that this game would be better with more guns. But I think players kind of got the idea of what we were going for. And it wasn't for everyone, but we were deliberately trying to get people who weren't gamers. Yeah.
One thing about Journey that's always fascinated me is the length. That's one thing. You can always play the game in about 3 hours. What was the decision behind keeping the length in such a short time? It could have easily been extended to sort of longer.
The question is, why did we keep the game at just 3 hours when it could have been extended? Well, one reason is resources. But I think another important reason is that we wanted players to be able to play with each other from beginning to end in one continuous session. We felt that was important for the keeping an emotional arc, similar to what you find in movies.
After working on it and having some of the problems with people being trolls, like you said, or just problems with people playing games in general, do you think now that you could achieve maybe in a different kind of game the same or a similar kind of emotional experience with more traditional games?
I remember when seeing the marketing material for Bungie's next game, what's it called? Yeah, I remember thinking, oh wait, this is Journey with guns. But I honestly have no idea what that game's going to be like. It's not out yet. Probably. I would be happy to see it.
So after playing through Journey, I played through it with like one person the entire time, like you said, the goal. His name flashed the screen at the end, and I tried to memorize it, his PlayStation tag, but I got it wrong. And he wasn't in my like friends list or my like recent players list.
Yeah.
He wasn't added to that list. And I wanted to speak to him so bad, like actually speak to him, to have such a big experience, and I couldn't reach him. Was that a purposeful design to not like add him to your recent players, or is that just
Honestly, I don't know. That sounds unfortunate. I'm sorry you had I'm sorry you had that experience.
I know this thing, instead of being able to talk to him, I just kind of sit there in my roommate and thought what that discussion would be.
Right. Some people do contact each other after the game is over. I was not involved in the tech of whether or not it goes in the recent players list. I don't know if something goes screwed up there or if it just never does that. I honestly don't remember. A green shirt? Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about the work atmosphere and team dynamics at that game company? I'm curious, like from your experience in Journey, like is anybody like allowed to contribute, or did you have like very strict, very clear restrictions in terms of like what you were doing with, for example, the camera, whatever?
The question was about, I guess, company culture. Journey, or that game company team has basically a flat hierarchy. We do have Genova being a creative director, which sounds like he's a leader. But it's more like just his role is creative director. Everyone on the team contributes to design ideas. It's small enough that we can all fit in one meeting room. And like during the development of Journey, every morning we'd all stand up and have a discussion about what we did the last day and what we're going to do today or the rest of the week or something like that. We would have frequent meetings where we all got together in a room to play through the latest version. And like my role was focused on the player character and the camera, but when the need arises, we all have to wear many hats, and I contributed to other aspects as well. Yep.
How does the PS3 compare to other development platforms you use?
The question was, how does the PS3 compare to other development platforms that I've used? So I got started working after they had already been working on the game for 2 years. By that point, they'd already kind of built up a system for deploying to the PS3. So I didn't have to worry too much about that. It is a pretty powerful system. I have no idea how it compares to the PS4, but I've been playing with mobile games lately, and nowhere near as powerful. So kind of have to be more creative with optimizing things. Let's see. Anything in particular you want to know about? Like, oh, I guess there was like the requirements that we had to do. Oh, what's it called? When like Sony says your game must meet these requirements in order to be playable. Yeah, those things. We had to deal with that, which is one of the things that you just have to deal with PlayStation that you don't have to deal with so much for Android. You definitely have to. With Apple, it's more weird. Like you just kind of predict what they want. But unfortunately, with Sony, there's a back and forth process where they say like, no, you need to have like a special kind of loading screen here or something. But they also made requests that we were ultimately able to convince them that we didn't need. Like Sony wanted gamer tags names above every player, and we convinced them that that was not what we wanted. So there's some flexibility there.
This might just be a coincidence, but the first time I played, I was with somebody who was also a first-time player, and after that, I was with people who weren't, who looked like they had played before, and I was wondering if that was on purpose or if there was any sort of like attempt to match at similar levels.
First-time players. Oh, the question is there any attempt to match first-time players with other first-time players? The answer is sort of. First-time players can never see white cloaks. I believe that's the only restriction. Yep.
Were there any gameplay mechanics or aesthetic changes that were the result of either technical or experiential limitations, as opposed to you just wanting to change it to like match your vision of the game?
The question is, were there any assets that had to change as a result of what we're trying to accomplish, or as a result of what?
The result of either like technical, like experiential, like limitations, like maybe like you just weren't quite as experienced with the system or like at the time, or something along those lines. Was there anything that changed because of that?
Okay, were there any assets that we had to change from our vision because of technical limitations? And Journey is the third PlayStation game that game company made, so by then they already kind of knew what the technical limitations were and probably designed around them. It was kind of our goal to impress people with pretty graphics. So we had engineers working on the sand shaded technology and the cloth simulation, and we kind of used these pretty fancy things as the components of our characters and designs.
According since it was already like 2 years in development, like how was your experience getting like integrated into the team for like making sure you're on track with what direction they're trying to go?
We had let's see, near the beginning when I was hired, Genovi took me aside for a lunch meeting and explained the vision for the game to me. And we had frequent meetings where we would talk about it all together, the vision. And the question was, as I was hired after the game had already been in development for 2 years, what was it like being integrated? And let's see, the team was small enough, did not take long to get to know everybody. In fact, I started living with a couple of coworkers after a few months. So that was cool. It was a tight-knit family.
So what's your favorite game to play that you've worked on? And if it's not Journey, what was it?
I don't think I can answer that question. It's like picking a favorite baby.
If I can suggest, and so technically we tend to have the room till 6, right?
Yes.
But are there's pretty low odds that someone actually reserves the room after 6 on Friday.
In fact, there's 0 odds.
0 odds. Okay, good. Because if I could suggest, there could still be more time for questions. But John's actually, so this is, if I'm not mistaken, you've given this presentation before, or someone like it elsewhere.
The camera thing? No.
Oh no, not the camera one. The facilitating stories.
Yes.
Okay, so you've given that one before, but he's also prepared a new presentation.
This is
I'm
only half prepared.
half prepared. If he could try it out with you all, it's about dynamic camera and his design he did for Journey. People are cool with that?
Yes.
Sweet. Okay, because there'll be more time for questions after that too. We want to make sure we got to it. Okay,
All right.
John Nesky.
Thank you.
Can I turn off the light? Yeah. Flashing.
So this is kind of what I did on Journey. I mean, this is like half of it. But this part is interesting because I don't really hear people talking about cameras in games much, other than complaining about them. So I actually had a sort of a personal connection to the camera in Journey. I have a girlfriend who gets simulator sickness from video games, which it's like motion sickness. It's basically the exact same thing as motion sickness. It's when your gyroscopes in your inner ear disagree with your eyes about what kind of motion you're feeling. So like when you're in the car, like the surroundings of the car look like they're stationary relative to you, but you can feel bumping up and down and going forwards and stopping and such. And when you're playing a game, it's the reverse. Your eyes say, oh, there's lots of motion on the screen, there's lots of motion, but your inner ear says, no, you're just sitting on the couch. And honestly, there needs to be a lot more research into this, but I think the theory at the moment is something like the body says, hey, my senses are disagreeing with each other, I must be sick. Let's vomit it out. Whatever's making me sick. But the theory doesn't really explain what to do about it, other than don't make the visuals different than what you're feeling. So I kind of have to trick people into not getting too sick. And for Journey, my girlfriend can play Journey mostly from beginning to end without any trouble, unless somebody else is playing and controlling the camera. In which case, the other person playing probably doesn't get as much motion sickness as probably swinging the camera around a lot more. Anyway, camera design. I don't know why we don't have the word gammatography, but cinematography, photography, gammatography makes sense to me. And the entire experience is filtered through the camera. Everything you do goes through the camera, everything you see. And I feel like there ought to be more discussion about this. Sorry. For Journey in particular, we know ahead of time we wanted a third-person perspective, so you could see your character. Players can wander in any direction, which means we can't know ahead of time what direction the camera should be looking at. That's pretty difficult trying to predict where the player wants to be looking. And we want the game to be accessible for people who don't know how to control cameras. There's a lot of people, when they come to start Journey, they have no idea what it's like to be controlling a camera, because that's not something you do in everyday life. Your eyes are your camera. You don't have like a camera flowing behind you all the time that you control. So that's not something that's intuitive to people who are not gamers. We also want so we want the camera to kind of do the right thing without you controlling it as much as possible. We also want it to look pretty. And we want it, for Journey, we had a mostly open environment, which is honestly a little bit easier than doing things inside a closed environment, because a big problem in camera design is what to do when walls get in the way between the camera and the player, when they break line of sight. And this is less of a problem in open environments, but it was still enough of a problem in Journey that we had to solve it. And when I was hired, there was already a camera for Journey that had been iterated on for 2 years. And it was derived from the flower camera that they used. But there were a lot of problems with it. One of the problems was rapid field of view shifts. That's when it's basically the zoom action on a camera. And unexpected zooming is a big contributor of motion sickness and also just disorientation in general. The camera often collided with obstacles when I was hired. Like the camera, we call it clipping when the camera enters the geometry for something. And it often lost line of sight with player. And the design of the camera was very much particle-based, and by that I mean there is some point in space that represents where the camera is, and there are forces acting on it that are pushing it around. And there'd be like a line of code that says, oh, there's a wall over there, push the camera this way a bit. There's a wall over there, push the camera this way. And the problem with this this particle-based motion is that often the forces pushing the camera in different directions would be competing with each other, and the camera wouldn't really know what to do. I call this indecisive camera motion. So my approach was to have a camera operator, a virtual camera operator that makes decisions about what to do rather than responding to forces. And it does this by taking in information from its environment and doing some number crunching and some logic, and then making a decision about which direction to move in. My goals that I formed kind of independently as I was becoming the camera guy on Journey was that cameras need to have beauty, utility, and accessibility. Beauty is probably the most well-established of these disciplines because of photography and cinematography. There's like rule of thirds, which says put important objects like on the 1/3 line from the edge or the 2/3 line. The 180-degree rule that says try to keep important objects on the same side of the screen relative to each other over time. And there's all these different techniques you can move the camera in different directions. And there's lighting and steady camera, focus, depth of field, mood, bokeh, bloom, fisheye, anti-aliasing, all of these things. And we had a lot of this stuff on Journey. The graphics technology engineers had a lot of fun working on this bokeh effect and bloom. Getting bloom to look right was actually a bit tricky. The old bloom wasn't good enough for us. Fisheye. When you have a high field of view in a virtual camera, you often see distortion around the edge of the screen, and we used a fisheye lens to distort it to a little bit back towards where you expect things to look like. Utility is the next goal. This is a very video game-oriented rule. And this is a third-person game, so you need to see where your feet can take you. The camera needs to show you where you should be going. Like at the beginning of Journey, the camera needs to be looking at the mountain, so you know that that's where you want to go. The camera also needs to preserve a sense of direction, so it can't be wildly swinging around all the time. It needs to kind of look more or less in the same direction as much as possible. But it also needs to be looking where the player wants to look. And this is honestly a prediction problem, because we don't really know where the player wants to look. Sometimes we want to tell the player to look at a particular thing, but often we just want the player to explore. So ultimately, we do have to fall back on user input. So depending on whether you want to use the controller tilt or the analog stick. Personally, I prefer analog stick, but controller tilt is something people are more likely to use at first, or at least people who are not gamers. The next goal, accessibility. As I said, controlling a third-person camera is unnatural. Controlling the player character and the camera at the same time is like patting your head and rubbing your belly. And then there's this question of should we control the camera with the controller tilt sensors, with the gyroscope, or should we use the right analog stick? And when I was hired, they had just like, this was after having worked on Flower, where the only way to control your motion is with the camera tilt, or the controller tilt. So at first in Journey, that was the only way you could control the camera in Journey too. But I felt like that wasn't sufficient, so I introduced the analog stick as well, so that more experienced players and also people who just want to have more control over the camera can use the analog stick. But supporting both at the same time was actually pretty tricky, because there's these two input sources, and you could be tilting the controller and tilting the analog stick at the same time. But I felt like if you're using the analog stick, that has to be very deliberate, whereas controller tilt is often accidental. So in this case, analog stick overrides controller tilt. And I've got various systems for kind of recalibrating controller tilt if you've held it in a different direction for a while, to minimize how much people accidentally tilt the camera with a controller tilt. But it still happens, unfortunately. I do have people complaining about the camera sometimes. Simulation sickness is another accessibility problem. Most of these accessibility problems are actually cognitive, but simulation sickness is just biological. And that was kind of where my personal motivation was, to create a graceful, fluid experience. Decisions to make about what the camera should be doing can mostly be boiled down to these 5 things. What should the field of view of the camera be? What should the distance to the target be, the focal object? What should the yaw pitch be? Like where is it pointed? What's the framing? Framing, I mean, obviously framing is like where objects are on the screen, but that, in order to control the framing, you control the lateral position of the camera and the vertical position. So in programmer terms, we're talking about translation and rotation, mostly. Rotation for yaw and pitch, and translation for framing. And motion is just talking about how these other components are changing over time. So when picking a field of view, this affects many different things. It affects the perception of scale. It affects perception of speed. Often in racing games, you'll see the field of view widen when you start going really fast, so that you can see all the things whizzing by the side of your vision. So you can expand the field of view to include more things around you, or you can contract to zoom in on very far away things. I think there's a typo here. Contract to expand to include more local things. Back on field of view. As I mentioned, changing the field of view can create sort of an effect of vertigo, which is great if you want to create an effect of vertigo, but be aware that different people experience different amounts of vertigo. So what might be the right amount of vertigo for you might be vomit-inducing for someone else. So I tried to change field of view very slowly, if at all, on Journey. And the distance. So this is how far away the camera is from the player, and strongly connected to field of view. So if you want a character to be, say, half a screen tall, then depending on what your field of view is, you want to be a different distance away from the player. Like if I have a really wide field of view, I need to get close up to the player so that it fills up my screen. But if I zoom in a lot and have a very narrow field of view, I can see a character from far away to fill the screen. So in Journey, the field of view and the distance to the player are two sides of the same variable. Like there's a variable that balances between one or the other to maintain a particular size of the player character on the screen. But there are definitely more concerns. When the camera is close to the player, it's much easier to navigate the camera around obstacles while maintaining line of sight. When the camera is far away, there's lots of opportunity between the camera and the player for something to get in the way. So when dealing with the problem of avoiding walls, bringing the distance closer is something we can use. Yaw and pitch. This is where the camera is pointed. And in an open environment like Journey, that's mostly outdoors, an important factor is the horizon. And if you keep the yaw and pitch constant, then the horizon is also constant on the screen because it's infinitely far away and it's not affected by translation of the camera. So you can use this technique when framing things. If you want the horizon or things on the horizon like the mountain or the sun to be in a particular place, all you need to worry about is yaw and pitch. You don't need to worry about the actual position of the camera. And I use this when trying to minimize motion sickness or simulator sickness. I would use the horizon as kind of an anchor point to make a part of the screen motionless, so that people who experience motion sickness can kind of focus their eyes on this anchor point to feel like they're not moving too much. But we do want to change the yaw and pitch a little bit when looking at things and when also dodging obstacles. Yaw in particular, I tried to move very slowly to create a graceful experience. If the yaw, pitch. The pitch is the vertical angle. And if that changes too much, it feels like a roller coaster. So actually on the camera input controls on the controller, the pitch controls influence the camera less than the yaw controls do. The range is much smaller. And tuning that right was a big part of the field decisions that I had to make. Framing is where things are on the screen, and we would always define the camera by where it had to be in order to put the character on a particular position on the screen. And here's where the rule of thirds comes in. We want the player, ideally, to be on one side of the screen or the other. Shadow of the Colossus actually did this pretty well. But we found that players got disoriented when they're trying to run forwards, but they're not in the middle of the screen. So in Journey, when you're running forwards, the character drifts towards the middle of the screen. But when you stand still, the character drifts towards one side or the other, depending on which direction they're facing. As I mentioned, the horizon, you can frame the horizon using yaw and pitch, but you frame things that are nearby using translation. And for motion, which is changing all of the other factors over time, this affects utility and accessibility a bunch. For utility, it's important to preserve sense of direction. That means no cuts unless you're Resident Evil. Or I've seen it in Devil May Cry, I've seen it in some other games. But like, the important thing is, if I'm holding forwards on the control stick, then I'm trying to go in that direction. And if the camera direction changes, then forwards on the controller changes. So what you end up with is a medium that, for the most part, doesn't have very many camera cuts compared to, say, TV or movies. Movies have way more camera cuts than video games do. And I think this is actually one of the problems the major problems why video games have so much more motion sickness problems than movies do, or at least in my experience. Because in movies, if you want to show something else, you can do a camera cut, and camera cuts don't involve any motion really. Whereas if you're not doing any cut, then you have to move the camera from one point to another, and that involves accelerating the camera, which is when the inner ear starts saying, hey, I'm supposed to be accelerating. So that's what you have to be careful about. Other things affect this too. I haven't seen the new Hobbit movie yet, but apparently the frame rate makes the Hobbit movie seem weird. On Journey, we locked it at 30 frames per second. 30 frames per second is pretty close to the movie standard of, I think, 27? 24? Sorry, 24, you're right. That makes much more sense. So the camera is making choices about where to move. This decision making that my virtual camera operator is doing is based on the player's inputs, or the player's actions actually, the player character running around. That's the important part. But also on the camera controls and the environment and scripting that we inserted into the levels. Like near the beginning of the game, when you get to the top of the mountain and there's the mountain framed in the distance, that's a script giving a hint to the camera saying, you should be looking at this. So it's a combination of these four things. And also, just kind of how the camera was the previous frame is one of the input factors in what we should do this frame, since we want to preserve a graceful sense of motion. For player action, this is running and jumping. And the camera is, often I find that games anchor the camera exactly to some offset from the player position, and keeping the player at exactly the same position on the screen, which is pretty good for making the player seem like an anchor point on the screen for this simulator sickness stuff. But it sometimes results in the environment moving too quickly, especially for jumping. When you jump up and down, this is often a very fast motion, and you don't really want the entire environment jumping up and down with you on the screen. So in Journey, the player is horizontally locked to the player, but lets the player jump up and down without bringing the camera up and down too much. It's pretty much only when the player gets too far up or too far down that the camera starts to follow with it. Camera control, this is the player using the analog stick or tilt to say where they want to look. And this is the thing that I'm saying is unintuitive for many people. It is intuitive in certain games, racing games and first-person games, because the camera control is basically the same thing as the player control. They're controlling where they'll look is how they play the game. And some other games like StarCraft, camera scrolling is very similar to what we're used to, like just moving around in Google Maps or scrolling a web page. But in 3D third-person games, that's where cameras start to feel unintuitive. This floating camera is an imaginary concept. Also, we run into people who have learned reversed camera controls. I'm actually one of them. And for a long time, people on Journey felt like there shouldn't be any camera control options. There should just be the one way to control the camera, because we felt like options would interfere with the experience. But we just ran into too many people who wanted the camera to behave one way and it behaved the opposite way. So there is a way to control or invert the axis on the camera in Journey. But the default control is kind of what you expect if you're not into flight sims. The environment, this is the walls and the dunes, the hills. when I'm watching the game, it's easy for me to say, oh, this camera is bad, is doing the wrong thing. But it's hard to formally describe what the camera should do in order to avoid problems, especially because we never know exactly what the player is going to do. So like, if I'm the player and the camera is behind me, I might decide to walk towards the wall, and then the camera will be pushed into the wall. And maybe it should slide out to one side or the other, or maybe it should just get close to the player. We do a little bit of each, depending on the situation. Ray casting is really the best thing we can do. Well, for some games, you can probably actually, in fact, a lot of games, like especially God of War that I know of, they have purely scripted cameras where the level designers will say this is exactly where the camera needs to go. Journey has some hinting here and there, but for the most part, it has to figure out for itself where to look. And the environment, we didn't have like enough man or woman power to put all of the information in the level to tell the camera where it should be. So kind of, as I said, it has to figure it out for itself, and it does that with ray casting. And I kind of developed my own technique, which is probably similar to some other people, where the camera has whiskers. It's actually the whiskers are coming from the target object, which is the player in this case. And they're trying to look for objects in the environment that might break a line of sight. And there are a couple of them that were moving horizontally, angled outwards from the camera, looking for walls. And there are also a couple of vertical ones, one trying to figure out what the slope of the floor is in front of you and behind you, and one looking for ceilings. And it can use these whiskers to kind of get a sense for how far the camera is allowed to move in one direction or the other before breaking line of sight. And this is the primary technique I used in Journey for avoiding obstacles. But I also had to tag a bunch of obstacles in the game as okay to break line of sight. These are mostly things like narrow columns. So like if there's a player here and a camera here, let's do it this way, player here, camera here, and there's a column passing this way, like the player's running this way, it's okay for that narrow column to break line of sight for a moment, because you're going to return the line of sight soon after you pass the column. And it would be much more awkward to have to swing the camera around and pull it closer to get in past this column. So one of the things that I did do in the levels to help the camera out was I would tag each obstacle as something that either does or does not bother to occlude the camera. So tagging these obstacles is one kind of the scripting that we did in the levels. And the other kind of scripting was the hinting. Looking at the mountain at the beginning of the game, that's the hint. There are other places where like there's a round tower, and as you're running around the tower, the camera is hinted to look towards the center of the tower and kind of spin around with you. So we had a few different kinds of hints that we would enable when the player enters a region that says like, look up or look down, or look at this object, or get closer or move further away. In particular, in interior environments, there are a few interior environments in Journey, and those are the places that are most dangerous for hitting obstacles. So that's when we try to move the camera closer to the player so that you don't have to swing around too widely to avoid obstacles. So camera takes in sources of information, makes decisions about these, based on these sources of information in order to accomplish goals. So I kind of went through this whole talk backwards. The goals are the beauty, utility, accessibility. That's what we're trying to accomplish. Field of view, distance, yaw, pitch, framing, and motion are the techniques we can use to accomplish those goals. And player action, camera control, environment, script, and previous frame are our basis for making our decisions to accomplish the goals. So there are many ways, probably, to do all this, but the way I chose to do it in Journey is figure out the yaw first. This is the horizontal angle. That's important for avoiding walls. This is every single frame, do this. Figure out the camera pitch second. You might have to move it up or down a little bit, excuse me, to avoid hitting the floor or the ceiling. In the cases where you need to shift field of view, do it slowly. And once you've figured out field of view, then you have sort of an imaginary view frustum, a sort of a pyramid in space that is the stuff that you can see. And you can translate the camera around to make sure that everything fits inside that pyramid, the view frustum. You can translate back and forth, and you can translate left and right for framing. And then you can do the math to figure out the actual camera transform matrix and give that to the rest of the game systems that need that information. So I update y'all first. I think I kind of went through this already. Let's try to control and do that. Oh yeah, there's many different things that can affect where the yaw needs to go. This is where the decision making comes in. First of all, if the camera is controlling the camera with the analog stick or the tilt, you must honor that. Otherwise, the camera or the players will get really frustrated. But that can be a problem when there's an obstacle in the way. So in that case, the only choice really is to bring the camera as close to the player as possible to avoid hitting things the player is standing right next to. If the player is not trying to control the camera, then we have a bit more freedom to make the camera swing left and right to avoid obstacles. And it prefers to swing left and right rather than pull close to the player, if it can. Let's see. The other factors besides player control is obstacles, script hints in the levels, and if nothing else is happening, just look in the direction the player is moving in. Or if the player is not moving, then stay put. Updating pitch is similar, must honor player control. Up to a limit though. You don't want to look straight up or straight down. This is not descent, this is journey. So there's actually very tight limits about how far you can look up or down in journey. But it has to be just enough that you can see what you want to look at. So if you want to look at the sky, you can do that. And in that case, the camera does have to pull closer in order to avoid digging into the ground. But if you're looking straight down or looking downish, then the camera can actually pull back a bit to get sort of a bird's eye view and show you everything around you that's near you. Pitch is also affected by the slope of the ground. At first, we just used the actual slope directly underneath your feet. But that can change dramatically depending on the shape of the terrain. What's more important is kind of the overall slope. So this is where raycasting comes in. I do some raycasts in front of me to figure out where the slope is, or like where like the threshold is between where the raycasts hit the ground and where the raycasts don't hit anything. And that's kind of my horizon as far as the camera is concerned. And I do that in both directions, forward and back. The backwards direction is very important for avoiding obstacles. But the forwards direction is important for showing where the player is going to be moving. So like if the player is moving forwards, then the camera should be looking in the direction the player is going to be moving in overall. And that's what the forwards raycast is for. And of course, hints can override this. And if the player is airborne, then it's actually pretty tricky. If the player is falling, you want to look down. If the player is flying, you kind of want to look up. But in Journey, most of the time, if you're flying, you're just going to fall back down as soon as you run out of power. So you don't really want to look up too much, because that's kind of if you fly and look up and then start falling, you won't be able to see where you're falling, and that'll be disorienting. So it's not really until the last level of Journey, where you have almost unlimited flight power, that the camera really looks exactly in the direction that you're flying in. Otherwise, it tends to bias towards looking down, especially when you're high above the ground. Like if I hop down, up and down just a little bit, then the camera pitch doesn't need to change at all. But if I jump really high and I start falling, then that's when you want to look down. Field of view. The field of view expands a little bit, so you can see a lot of sky when you look up. It contracts when you look down, or it stays pretty stable usually when you look down. We do the racing game thing a little bit, where when you're going fast, the field of view expands a little bit. When standing still, contract to get a closer view of the horizon. But all of this do very slowly. The exception to the rule, actually, is when looking up at the sky. What you don't want to happen is to change the pitch to look up at the sky and then change the field of view. If there's a lag on the field of view, that feels weird. So I actually lock field of view and pitch to move at the same speed. So like as you're looking down, you'll have a narrow field of view, and when you look up at the sky, it moves at the same speed. So you don't end up with like a shift where you move up and change the pitch and then you're zooming in and out, because that was disorienting. The distance to the player, I already talked about this a lot. Move closer to avoid hitting things. Oh yeah, important. When you are near another player, you want to be able to see both players together. And there's basically two ways to do this. One is to expand the field of view. The other one is to pull the camera far away. And I chose to just pull the camera far away. And one of the problems here was that players look nearly identical. So in the case where there's two people together, I will always have the main player in the center of the screen. I don't do the rule of thirds thing anymore when there's two people together. So that way you always know the players in the center of the screen is you, and the players that's off on one side or the other is the other player. Framing. There's rule of thirds. When players moving forwards, keep them together, keep them centered so they can aim to see where they're going. So we have a technique for smoothing that we confusingly call snapping. Just an in-house word that doesn't really mean anything useful. But, I mean, it means something useful, but it's confusing. There's a mathematical function called lerp that we use a lot in programming that just interpolates from one number to another. And we generally have like the current position and the target position. In every frame, we move the current position slightly closer to the target position. This works for angle, this works for translation, this works for a bunch of different properties. So this creates a more graceful motion, but sometimes you want to be even more graceful. This snapping technique makes the first derivative continuous, I think. Yes, but does not make the second derivative continuous. But you can do the same thing twice. You can have like a target which is attracted to another target. And if you do two of these lerp things every frame, you actually end up with a second derivative continuous motion. which means the acceleration is continuous. And we need to do that a bunch to avoid feeling like the camera's jerking around. I already talked about whiskers. My particular strategy for the whiskers was every single frame I would do one rate cast for each direction that I'm going in. And then the next frame, I would test a little bit to the side and test a little further the next frame and keep going until I hit something. I would do more rate casts. Like ideally, you would just do like rate casts everywhere to figure out where the obstacles are. But that's a performance problem. You need so to optimize it, I would just do one rate cast each frame, and I could kind of rely on the environment looking pretty much the same as it did the last frame. Temporal coherence is the fancy word for when things are pretty much the same, roughly, from one frame to the next. So I know if I know that last frame this raycast hit something, then maybe pull it back a little bit to see if I can get it to not hit. If I know that if it hit last frame and it doesn't hit the next frame, then in between those two whisker raycasts is probably where the obstacle is. So over time, the whisker would kind of swing to the side until it hit something, and then it would kind of wobble back and forth over the threshold. And I would use that on both sides to figure out where the obstacles were. And I would kind of move with the obstacles as they moved relative to the camera. And that worked pretty well for me. So comparing my techniques for the Journey camera versus what we had before, for me at least, this decision-based approach was easier to think about and maintain than the particle-based approach, because often the particle would do something and you wouldn't know why. Like there's many forces acting on it all at once, and the sum of all of these forces is that it moves in this particular direction, but I don't know why. So I had to maintain this for a year, so I wanted something that was easier for me to think about. Oh yes, my sim sickness prone friends can play too, including my girlfriend, but not exclusively my girlfriend. I'm happy that many people can play this game. What? Okay. Beginners do get lost in Journey. I see people wandering off to the side. One of the things we do to counter this in Journey is when you get to the boundary of the level, it does try to swing the camera to look towards the next goal. But ideally, players wouldn't get more lost than they want to. I've had various ideas about how to better resolve conflicts when line of sight is broken. At the moment, the whiskers that I was talking about are not perfect. Every once in a while, some obstacle will come from an unexpected direction and break a line of sight. And in that case, the only thing I have left to do is pull the camera closer until it's past the obstacle. And I can do that fast or slow. If I do it slow, it doesn't create motion sickness, but it does end up making you feel like you don't know where your player is for a long time and you get really confused. So it'd be nice to avoid this line of sight breaking altogether. Either that, or create a path that the camera can follow to restore line of sight, besides just jumping closer. Because jumping closer does create motion sickness. And I have this idea of a tether maybe that like bends around obstacles, and then the camera moves to get rid of the bends in the tether. I've never tried this. I don't know if it'll work. but it might be a nice way to restore line of sight. And simulation sickness is complex. Journey is not perfect. I mean, really, the only perfect way to avoid simulation sickness is to not have motion on the screen, and honestly, nobody likes that. The tilt versus stick thing. This was a discussion that came up many times during Journey. I have my preferences, but I can understand why the tilt is available. Like I said, trying to run and control the camera at the same time is like patting your head and rubbing your tummy, for beginners especially. And tilting is more inviting. In fact, I know when I was first playing games and I was tiny, tilting is just something I did naturally when I was playing Contra. I think pretty much everybody kind of has this feeling like they should be tilting the controller when they first play a game, and it kind of looks dumb for experienced players, but it's what newbies do. And we took advantage of this to make that the way you control the camera. But it's definitely prone to accidental input. I had to do some fancy recalibration to make sure that you could play while lying on your stomach and having the controller facing you. And stick is way more precise. And thanks for listening.
Again, feel free questions, not just about camera, but still about general Journey or whatnot.
Okay.
When you were hired onto the project, did they get you specifically for camera work, and had you done some of that before, or did they kind of bring you as a general programmer and you fell into that role?
The question was I hired specifically for camera work? And the answer is no. In fact, I had never worked on a 3D third-person camera before. I worked on various games before, mostly two-dimensional games, occasionally three-dimensional games, but nothing quite like this, nothing with this kind of camera. So it's kind of something I had to learn on the fly. And I studied a little bit by just watching movies, and I found that I had to watch movies that I've already seen and mute it in order for me to actually pay attention to the camera. Otherwise, I'd be paying attention to the story. And I also put I ripped up little post-it notes and stuck them onto my screen, marking anchors on the screen, and so I could watch how things move relative to the anchors. That was helpful for me. And that was something I did in Journey too. I'd actually I would even put my finger on the screen saying, okay, the camera's, or the player's here on the screen, and keep my finger there and run around to see if the player moves relative to my target.
Just really quick, could you describe kind of where you started with your experience in creating video games and the skill set that you gained along the way? I don't want to use the word journey, but I might journey to journey, if you will.
The question was how I got started making games, I think, and the skills I learned in general or on Journey? In general. Well, I started playing games before I knew how to read. As soon as I figured out they were made by human beings, I knew I had to do that. I was actually pretty lucky, I guess. I knew what I wanted to do with my life pretty early on, compared to many people, I think. In middle school, I did my first little bit of programming, but I didn't really do programming until high school. I was lucky I went to a high school that had programming classes. And then I did a little bit of modding of small first-person shooters. I don't know if anyone's heard of Marathon, but it's like Doom, except on Macs. Yeah, Bungie. Yeah. I went to college for computer science at Carnegie Mellon University. It's a fantastic school. There was a club at Carnegie Mellon that Chris DeLeon is the president of, or was the president of. He's wearing the shirt right now. And I think that was kind of when I got addicted to making games, to the point where I stopped doing homework, which I don't necessarily recommend, but I dropped out after 2 years And then I stayed a third year in Pittsburgh, where Carnegie Mellon was, just for hanging out in this club and making games with people. And then Chris found me a job at Zip Play in San Francisco. And then Chris found me another job at that company. As for lessons learned, too many? I mean, one of the important things for me definitely was being independently motivated. I loved games. It turns out I love making games. I do it outside of any requirements. If I stopped making games for a living, I would continue to make games on the side anyway. I enjoy game jams, 48-hour things, or doesn't have to be 48 hours. Any kind of collaboration I enjoy, and I encourage meeting people and working on things and teaching yourself when necessary. I think there's a lot of frustrating aspects to game design or game development, but with perseverance, you can learn most of it with the information that's available on the internet. Okay.
So you were talking about using fairly established film techniques for figuring out where a camera should go, right? These are things that theory was sort of devised a long time ago for film. Rule of thirds and 180 degree rule and things like that. Have there been do you think that being beholden to those sorts of things are because we've just been trained for 100 years to look at it that way? Or is there a way to retrain the viewer for a different type of camera experience in games?
The question was, on Journey, we used techniques such as rule of thirds that were developed for cinematography and photography. And did we feel beholden? What? I guess, how do I feel about that? Well, there's a language of an unspoken language of cinematography that I think people sort of intuitively understand. And I personally did not feel the need to challenge it too much. I felt like a lot of it resonated with me already. Certainly, there's plenty of room for games with camera designs that have nothing to do with cinematography. StarCraft is an example. But Journey was the kind of game where we wanted to create an experience that felt like a movie. Yeah, you.
This one?
Yeah.
So I guess along the same lines of that, like it seems like the approach with Journey was very much you're telling a story that was very much in the vein of how a story inside cinema is constructed, which you talked about and like showing the arc and stuff. So I wonder if your camera design works as far as facilitating that kind of story, but do you see other stories being able to be told in video games effectively? Because like it's like Journey tells a great story, but at the same time, you guys are trying to tell a story like a movie tells a story, and a story that really matters is the one the players have hits that template that got created. So it's like, is there a way to then use cameras that aren't conventionally like cinema cameras essentially to make stories that are different than what can be told in another medium?
The question is, do we? So the stories. I feel like the word story.
It's like almost like the reliance on cinema camera and like conventional cinema camera has existed in games up to this point. And it's like I feel like it's like, do you see a way for us to embrace a whole different language of camera to actually tell stories effectively in games? Because most of the effective stories that have been told in games have been told through cameras that act like cinema cameras. If that makes sense.
I guess the question is something like, do we really need to use cinematic cameras to tell the kind of stories that we're telling in games like Journey? And honestly, the answer is we can't use cinematic cameras for the cutting problem that I mentioned earlier, where movies cut all the time and games can't most of the time. So we do have to invent new things a little bit. And as for storytelling, I think a lot of what we were trying to accomplish, or a lot of what we ended up accomplishing, rather, was not to tell a story, but to create like a framework for players to tell their own stories, or to experience their own stories and then share them afterwards. And we just need to make a context that is conducive to experiencing these stories. And a lot of that has to do with the experience of playing the game. And that means we need to worry about accessibility and utility. As I mentioned, there's beauty, accessibility, utility. And of those three requirements for designing a good camera for a game, beauty is the only one that's similar to movies. So the other two definitely have an impact on the experience and contribute to the story that the players feel. Does that answer your question?
So it seems like, I guess Journey's a great example that like I think, from my perspective, I think stories are better told in games when they emphasize player action. So like in the sequence you guys have when you see what you did, that means a lot more than essentially walking through an environment created by developers that are trying to almost like force a story on you, whereas in Journey you're essentially creating your own. That interaction with other players kind of forms that. So it's almost like lifted outside of just like what you're seeing.
I'd be interested to see a game that retells the story of whatever you did in a more movie-like fashion. We have recorded replays already, but I wonder if it'd be cool to see recorded replays that edit out the boring bits and frame it in a particular way to create a story. I think that'd be cool.
Probably just 5 or 10 more minutes of questions so we can wrap up by 7.
Okay.
So you said you wanted, or as the team wanted, the fight at the end to be the big release for the game?
Yep.
I'm sure you probably are. Are you aware of the ability for 2 players in proper coordination to fly indefinitely?
Yes. What?
Was it? Sorry.
I called it tandem flying or something like that. Yes, that is. And the question was, are we aware that 2 players can fly indefinitely on their own before they get to the final release at the end where they can fly a lot? And yes, the answer is yes, of course. But the tandem flying is an advanced technique, first of all. And second of all, you can only use that to fly horizontally. There's sort of an imaginary invisible ceiling based on where you were standing when you started flying. And you can't fly higher than that ceiling, no matter how much the 2 players charge each other. As opposed to the last level where you can fly upwards pretty much indefinitely.
I was just curious, like when you discovered that, or maybe you foresaw it, like did you think about taking it out or trying to take it out, or did you find that wasn't really an issue in terms of sort of undermining the release of the game?
I think we loved it too much to take it out.
What work have you done previously that convinced that game company to hire you for camera design?
They did not hire me for camera design. They hired me as a field engineer. And camera design, or working on the camera, was one of the first things that I worked on. It's not the only thing I worked on. I also worked on the player control. But as for the question was, what did I do in order to get that company to hire me for this role? And well, I worked on many games. I published them on my website, johnnesky.com, right there. Many of these games were on teams, demonstrating that I can work on teams. Many of them were alone, demonstrating breadth of technique. Some of them were player-centric. Some of them were, like character-centric. Some of them were more top view type games. I've done art for games. I've done programming for games. I think the thing that they were looking for most, though, was a shared understanding of what they're trying to accomplish with this game. Journey was, they never want to make a game that's much like most of the other games that are being made. And so they were looking for people who could have this shared vision. Okay.
So one of the last things that John had done before, so I knew Rob not over there, but that reminded me to connect these two people was for a game jam game, you would make floats.
Oh yeah.
Because you guys know Flow was followed by Flower by that game company. So one of the kind of jokes from Kelly was always that like people who make something called floats, which John independently like for his game jam, he made floats, which I think maybe sort of resonated as like he's clearly thinking in that space.
True.
So we can make journeyers.
We haven't done Journey Year yet.
If you make a game that looks like a fan art game of a company you're applying to that might speak their language.
Flowny.
Hey, you seem to care about them.
All right.
You're likely to hire to get that stuff. Yes. That is it. For sure.
So, back to multiplayer component, when I was first playing through the game, I was playing with someone for a long time and we got to the tower level and I lost track of them and found them a minute or two later just sitting down and then they dissolved in front of me, which was kind of horrifying. I assume they disconnected or something, but like in some ways that was a very powerful experience in devastating way. Was that considered like yeah, I didn't hear about that when you were talking about multiplayer.
The question is, what's the deal with players disintegrating? Yes, that's what happens when players disconnect. This can happen for many reasons. Maybe the power goes out, maybe the internet gets lost, maybe they just stopped playing. They had to deal with something happening in their room where they're living and playing. And we couldn't really get around this problem. And honestly, I don't know if this disintegrating thing was the right thing to do, but it's kind of a graceful way of saying you can't play with them anymore. And the fact that it was a powerful and devastating experience is not necessarily counter to what we're going for. We're trying to create these connections between people, and the fact that breaking a connection is devastating means we're doing something right, I think.
So I've got to sort of pack some equipment. I've got a meeting to run to. I'll need this laptop for the microphone. That said, John's not going to dissolve. So obviously, to whatever degree he's not exhausted now, certainly welcome to keep chatting with him, hang out. Can I get a quick picture of the people who stuck around through all this for the 2 hours with John? We'll put it up on the VGDev Facebook group. But first of all, thanks, Mark and John. And if we can get people to sort of pile up right quick, we'll get that photo in Jet.